Hey everyone, welcome back to my Anthropology Journal podcast. This week's lesson was about how race categories are invented, changed, renamed, and repackaged on censuses, in state databases, in demographic tools. Well, I want to take that core idea and look at how the same politics of classification play out around the world. What this week's lesson really highlighted is that counting people isn't neutral. When a state decides what boxes exist, it's also deciding what stories get told about who belongs, who stands out, and who disappears statistically. The US timeline made that clear. Mulatto, Black, African American. Each shift wasn't about biology, it was about redefining people to fit the politics of the era. Canada's visible minority category does similar work. One label that lumps together everyone, non-white and non-Indigenous, even if their histories, privileges, and barriers are completely different. So let's zoom out. Take India. The census there recognizes caste, but in a way that smooths over caste hierarchy. People from dominant groups can claim other backward class status for benefits, while Dalits often underreport their caste because the stigma travels with the label. So the numbers end up telling a story of mobility that hides ongoing discrimination. That's the same problem our lesson pointed to. Categories shape what governments pretend is happening. France goes the opposite direction and bans race data entirely. The idea is that if you don't count race, racism magically disappears. But anthropologists have shown that without data, activists can't prove discrimination in housing, policing, or employment. The state gets to claim equality, while inequality just becomes statistically invisible. It's basically the extreme version of Canada's hesitation to collect detailed race-based data. If you don't track it, you can always insist the problem is unconfirmed. Brazil gives us another angle. The lesson discussed how people can be read differently depending on where they are. In Brazil, the census recognizes a whole spectrum of racial terms. But when Brazilians move to North America, all those nuances collapse into Black or Latino. A single person can shift racial categories just by changing location, which proves the lesson's point. Race is a moving target because it's created socially, not genetically. Now let's bring this back to Canada's current reality. The Canada by the Millions video looks fun, but it sticks out to a feel-good narrative about population growth without acknowledging the structural inequalities layered underneath. Our lesson pushed us to ask, what happens when you use categories like visible minority populations that hide more than they reveal? And what does it mean when the census treats mixed race identity as a statistical inconvenience instead of a lived experience? It directly affects policy. If you classify Kamala Harris as multiple visible minorities, you erase the fact that anti-Black racism and anti-South Asian racism target people in different ways. When the data collapses those experiences, decision makers can pretend the disparities aren't there. This becomes even clearer when we connect it to wealth, something not deeply covered in the lesson, but completely tied to how people are categorized. The American racial wealth gap didn't appear because Black families underperformed. It was engineered by housing policy, banking rules, and redlining. You can't see these patterns unless you track race over time. Canada avoids facing its own version because we barely collect that level of detail, especially around wealth. For Indigenous peoples, the pattern is even more blatant. The Métis script system wasn't a random historical misstep. It was a data-driven tool that converted land into coupons the government knew could be exploited by settlers. On paper, it looked like voluntary sales. In reality, it was a transfer of wealth out of Indigenous communities and into settler hands. When census categories treat land loss as invisible, the story becomes individual families made bad choices instead of the state designed a system to extract land. Anthropology helps us see all this because it treats labeling as an exercise of power. Our lesson emphasized that categories shift over time and differ across cultures. What it didn't say outright, but what becomes obvious when you look globally, is that classification is one of the quietest tools of inequality. Whoever controls the boxes controls the narrative. So when we talk about race data from 1790 to 2010, or Canada's struggle to define racialized groups, we're not really talking about labels. We're talking about who gets recognized, who gets erased, and who gets statistically justified into marginalization. Thanks for listening. See you next episode.